Welcome, my friends, to the NEWSPASTE Podcast with me, your host, Johnny Vedmore, and I am delighted to be back with you. The last episode was the first episode that I've recorded in quite a while, for the first proper one, the one with Ruckus. And it was a beautiful experience to get back on the road, because I really do love talking with people. And today I've got someone very special with me who you can already see. Uh, he is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. How do you say it, Marcus? Do you say Papadopoulos or do you say Papadopoulos?
The latter, Papadopoulos. But do you know what? After 45 years, or 46, because I turned 46 only recently, many of my friends whom I've been friends with for some 3 decades now, they still pronounce it incorrectly. So it doesn't really bother me if people mispronounce it. If they get it right, splendid. But it's a long name, it's a foreign name. If a Greek person was to mispronounce it, that would be somewhat bizarre. But other than that, it's perfectly fine.
I would have ended up calling you, if I knew you for longer, I'd ended up calling you Papa Marcus. That's what I would have called you.
Oh, that sounds
Most
quite
definitely.
nice, providing no references to someone who owns a laundrette in EastEnders. I never watched EastEnders, or I rarely ever watched it, but people would say to me, do you have a family member who owns the laundrette in EastEnders? And some of them came across as being serious. And I just thought to myself, oh dear God, it's fiction. There is no Mr. Papadopoulos who owns a laundrette. But
I've
anyway.
heard a lot of these sort of things where people see stars in real life and are unable to detach themselves from the fiction. And in that sense, that's what we're going to do a lot of talking about today. Or well, how the environment is in the world. We don't understand, most humans anyway don't seem to understand the difference between fact and fiction. They don't see where something's got a narrative that's been created, and that is really, it can be funny when it's to do with a soap opera, but when it's to do with potential world war, nuclear holocaust, it's of course a lot less funny. So we're examining, in that sense, the sharp end of that stick, the real sharp end of that stick. So, I mean, you're a British historian, analyst, author, etc., and you specialize in Russia, former Soviet Union. How did you start out on this journey? What did you first go to study? What was your ideas when you were a teenager? What did you want to do?
Well, it was long before I was a teenager. It was at around the age of 5 when I developed a very strong interest in the Second World War, and specifically the Eastern Front, the contest between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army. And that led me on to developing a profound interest in Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany. I then started at university at the age of 19 in September of 1997 at London Guildhall University, where I studied law and modern history. Following that, I studied modern history at Royal Holloway, University of London. And following that, I was awarded a Ph.D. in Russian history, also at Royal Holloway, University of London. And for some 20 years now, ever since I finished my PhD towards the end of 2006, I have been involved in politics, in academia, and in journalism. And what I can say, Johnny, is this. When I started out with my career towards the end of 2006, early 2007 and onwards, in the context of Britain, it was very, very lonely for me. Because let me give you an example. When the Western, Turkish, Israeli and Saudi-backed Islamist uprising broke out in Syria in the summer of 2011, and when the war really began in that country towards the end of 2011, I was the only person in Britain who was going on television and saying that the Syrian people are faced with a foreign-backed Islamist war, and the Syrian government is the defender of multi-confessional Syria. For example, without the Ba'ath Party, without President Assad and his father before him, Hafez, the Christians in Syria would have had no protection whatsoever. As I said, Johnny, things started to change after a few years into that war. More people started joining our side. When they started joining our side, they started reassessing everything they had been told about the Western world in terms of foreign policy, but also at home. And sometimes in life, we, as in mankind, requires a dark, sinister catalyst to open our eyes to what is happening around us. And that dark, sinister catalyst was the COVID lie. Because as a result of the COVID lie, there are now tens of millions of people throughout the Western world, especially in Britain, who are now awake, who now understand the actual structure of power in the Western world, and they understand the nature of the people who rule, not govern, who rule the Western world. They can now see how these pedophilic, sadistic, psychopathic killers who rule the Western world hate the nations, the indigenous people of the Western world. They can see how their foreign policy is absolutely corrupt, is absolutely duplicitous, and so on and so on and so on. People throughout the Western world are now thinking for themselves. They are now questioning. They are now critical. And so even though, Johnny, we are still faced with a terrible, terrible peril, what with the whole 2030 agenda, there is some hope. After all, hope dies last. If I go back to 2007, they were very lonely times for someone like me. Everything has changed now. The atmosphere has changed. The environment has changed. And quite frankly, Johnny, those Britons or those Americans or those French or those Canadians, for example, who still have not woken up, my advice to people who are enlightened, who now are awake, is to forget those people, because they cannot be retrieved. They cannot be saved. We have to keep on spreading the word of truth to people out there who have woken up, but they need more information. They need more knowledge. They need more analysis. So if someone says to me, Johnny, in Britain or in America, oh, there's no such thing as a political police force in Britain or in America, or for example, another example, oh, paedophilia is not being normalized in Britain or in America, they are absolutely worthless. They cannot be saved. I wouldn't even bother spending 10 seconds of my time on them for the reasons I have already stipulated, but also such people are not good for one's mental health. So there is a war raging in the Western world. and who knows how it's going to end. I've always said that if Britain, or I don't believe that a country called Britain actually exists any longer, but if the British people are going to be saved, and when I say the British people, I mean the four nations who comprise the British people: English, Welsh, Scottish, and Northern Irish. If the British people are going to be saved, then it could very come down to what happens in America. Because if America collapses, then the British ruling elite will beat a hasty retreat. They might not fall from power, but they will have to carry out a tactical retreat. And in doing so, they will throw many of their useful idiots under the bus, so to speak. Useful idiots in politics, in journalism, in the police, in academia, in charities, and so on and so on. So, in short, things are so much better today in the Western world than they were prior to the COVID lie. There are some things which are just horrific beyond belief, but the very fact that tens of millions of people are now awake in the Western world is something to rejoice about.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. Hallelujah. Praise the Lord, you could say. Most definitely, I have to say that when I look back, and I've described my own journey a lot, we must be around the same age. I would think you're probably about a year older than me. I'm 44.
I'm 46.
Yeah, okay. Well, 44 and a half. Let's I get it closer. When we were being brought up, we were, of course, we would go to the video store, and get a VHS to watch with the family or whatnot, or we'd go to HMV or the like and get a video, and we watch it, and we'd enjoy, like, the cultural, the movies, maybe a documentary here and there, but most of what was given to us was programming, really. I mean, I understand that now, and of course it seems to be the digital world, the internet changed everything. I mean, I tell a story about being raided by the police in 2000, and it was about 2003, because we were growing weed in the house. I was just moving out of the house at the time, and I had these two big boxes that were full. I was desperately, like, confused by September the 11th. I didn't understand it. I didn't know what it was. I still was on the side of believing the narrative, but the narrative was so fractured and broken and the reality just did not fit the narrative, that it meant I was constantly wondering about it. And I worked in hotels at the time, so I'd bring home newspapers every day, the free newspapers, and I would store them up, and I was thinking I will do something with these eventually. I didn't know I was going to be a journalist then. I just knew that I needed that feeding of information was massively important to my well-being, my mental well-being. And then the police raided us for growing weed, and they didn't take any of the weed growing equipment. They just took the two boxes of newspaper articles about September the 11th, and it blew my mind. Like, then, and then it was like the waking up through wonderful documentaries like Loose Change and other things that kind of like made me go, okay, I'm not only going to question all narratives, but I'm gonna have to just investigate this quietly on my own. And I think a lot of people felt like that as soon as the veil started to come down, about, say, 2003, 2004, as the access to information got more. A lot of us started to wake up slowly, and some quicker than others, and then there was a load that would never wake up. The people who you might say don't necessarily have full control or access to their inner monologue, and are unable to go through things, and have been bred that way. And I have what you described to me there was the same sort of journey. By about 2007, I was looking into the darkness. I was already ill at that point, and I was looking at a world where everything was going wrong all the time. There was lies. I had discovered that most of the things that I thought were true weren't actually true, or at least weren't allowed to be debated out loud, or you would be called names. And that worried me. And like you say about the Syrian conflict there. I mean, around that time, I think that's when this sort of access to media becomes so much that a new media started to be born from it. One which was then quickly co-opted, and I think that the Syrian conflict was, a real turning point in that moment, because there was a lot of suddenly these new independent journalists who were suddenly the lead speaking and taking the lead on this. And I thought, of course, like most people, I think everybody's a hero until they let me down. And that's how I felt with that. But years have gone by now. I've had much experience, as have you. And I understand that world that we believed was true was a fabrication. And was there ever a point in our lifetime where we were told the truth, Marcus, or have we always been living a lie, per se?
Well, I should say, first of all, that perhaps I was a different kind of child, a different kind of teenager, because when I was at infant school, when I was at junior school, for example, in the mid and late 1980s, I was expressing disdain for the British ruling elite, and in particular for the British royal family. I remember distinctly in 1987 saying to a teacher of mine, my class teacher, whom I got on very well with, that the Soviet army, which was at the time was fighting in Afghanistan, is fighting against extremists. And I think she was totally taken back by that and couldn't understand why a 7, 8-year-old was coming out with such words.
Blasphemous words.
Blasphemous words. Throughout the 1990s, when I was at secondary school, and then I started at university, I was highlighting the West's role, cardinal role, in the dismemberment of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Tito's Yugoslavia. And I argued, again, when I was at secondary school, and then in 1999, when I was in my second year of university, when NATO began its bombardment, its criminal, murderous bombardment of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which is comprised of Serbia and Montenegro. So throughout the 1990s, I was saying the Serbs have been demonized. The Serbs are a great, patriotic, pious people who have always fought for freedom. And I remember in 1999, during the aforementioned NATO's air campaign against Serbia, I remembered saying the Serbs are fighting against the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army, which was firstly a terrorist organization, and secondly, an organized crime syndicate, which specializes, and still does to this day under a different name, under a different guise, which specializes in human trafficking, in organ trafficking, in drug trafficking, and gun trafficking. And I remembered saying at university in 1999 and to my friends that we should be supporting the Serbs. And under no circumstances should KLA people be allowed into Britain. Again, this was in 1999, because I said they will bring organized crime with them. Well, most British people at that time, Johnny, didn't have a clue what I was talking about, including the students at university. And then, of course, the attacks in New York and Washington occurred. They were used, as we know, as a pretext for invading Afghanistan, firstly, in late 2001, and then in Iraq in early 2003. Have we ever been told the truth? Well, I can't say that we've never been told the truth. That would be, an extreme answer. But clearly, the fundamentals regarding so-called democracy in Britain, so-called humanitarian aspect, morality of British foreign policy, of American foreign policy, that is clearly not just a lie, but it is a monstrous lie. And again, as a child, I was very well aware of that. As a teenager, as a young adult, and to the present, none of this, what we see happening today, comes as any surprise to me. There are some things, of course, which I didn't foresee. For example, the normalization of paedophilia, the normalization of Satanism. Now, someone could say, who's normalizing paedophilia? Well, for example, in America, in Canada, in Britain, there is what is known as minor attracted people. And again, at the beginning of 2021, I was the first person in Britain to go on television and warn that paedophilia was being rebranded in the Western world as minor attracted people. So I've always said this, Johnny, people don't have to take my word for it, just take to the internet. And regarding the normalization of Satanism, well, I say this to them. Only a few years ago, the BBC ran a succession of articles saying, if you think you know about Satanism, then think again. So, as I said moments ago, people don't have to take my word for it. Take to the internet, put in BBC News, followed by the word Satanism, and they will see for themselves. So clearly, the fundamentals of what we have been taught, what we were told from day one about democracy in the Western world, and the, you know, how the Western world is the defender of democracy, freedom, the rule of law, mankind, civilization, is a complete and utter falsehood. As I said in my first answer to you, Johnny, things are terribly, terribly bleak today, but we must celebrate because massive progress has been made. And I do think, in regard to the 2030 agenda, we haven't derailed it because we need more people to come out and actively say no, actively defy. There's no point people saying, and I'm sorry to have to say this, but, well, I'm only following instructions. Well, I'm frightened. That's no good. You have to defy evil. So until millions more people come out and do what you are doing, what I'm doing, what other people are doing, then we won't be able to derail the agenda. But so far, people like you and I have managed to slow it down. So it shows that the Western ruling elites are not invincible. They're exceptionally powerful. They are exceptionally intelligent. They are masters of psychology. And I'm talking about the heart of the Western ruling elites. I'm not talking about their politicians or their journalists, etc., because these are just useful idiots. Yeah. But the fact we have slowed it down, Johnny, shows that they can be defeated.
Yeah, and you know what you're saying there. What I was thinking in my brain is, you know, the Venn diagram that which shows our lived real experience and the supposed reality that we're fed has very little crossover. There's a tiny little sliver, and that's where most of the people live. That's where most of the people live in their mind. They live in this little sliver where they're trying to, they know it's there, but they're forced into this point where they can't, if they go too far over there, they'll just become drones, basically. And if they go over here, it's really scary where we are. And you know, I completely agree that I was talking to a very close friend about Satanism recently, and I was explaining to this friend that Satanism was bad. It's a real simple concept, you know. They worship evil. whether you care or not, they worship evil and they will do dark things, and do what thou willst is not a nice sort of like, motto to live by. It's always going to end with other people who are not within their group being the ones who are getting things negative done to them. And this friend saw, and I can understand why, just saw Satanism as a religion. And so, oh well, at least they're doing their stuff. But with most religions, you're taught do good, do good, do good. With Satanism, you're just told you can do whatever you want, and being evil is good. So it's no longer living in a reality when you believe that Satanism is just a religion on the side. You are setting yourself up to be run roughshod by Satanists who are there is. A lot of people will only open up to you about their spirituality once you get to know them. And
well, can I say this very quickly about what?
Say it very quickly or slowly, I don't mind.
That's a pertinent observation you've just made. So there are key stitches, there are key threads which hold a fabric together. If those threads are undone, then the fabric will fall apart. Thus, the British ruling elite could never have achieved what it has achieved in the UK without, first of all, diluting Christianity. This seems inconceivable now in Britain, but there was a time, not so many years ago, say 60 years ago, back in the 1960s, when Britain was an extremely pious country. Just walk down your road, for example, and count the amount of churches you see. So the British ruling elite understood back in the 1960s that if they are to achieve their abominable aims, they will have to firstly destroy Christianity in Britain, followed by destroying the culture of the British people. The fact that your friend, Johnny, told you that Satanism is, quote, merely a religion demonstrates how remarkably successful the British ruling elites have been. Because if you went back to the 1960s in Britain, or into 1950s, or even for a part of the 1970s, if you said that in public, that Satanism is merely a religion, you would be treated as a leper, and rightly so. Mm-hmm. But speed forward to the present day, 2024, people do not understand the dangers of Satanism. Mm-hmm. One of the greatest, or actually, let me reword that, the greatest achievement of the devil is having convinced so many people that he does not exist. Because if you convince people, if the ruling elite of your country, be it the American ruling elite or the British ruling elite, over years convince by various means their populations that the devil doesn't exist, then naturally people will think, well, then God doesn't exist. Because if evil doesn't exist, good doesn't exist. And that is one of the main reasons why society in Britain, in America, is dead. It's not injured, it's dead. Because people think, well, do you know what? I don't have to worry about going to hell, because there is no hell. There is no heaven. I will do as I please. I will say whatever I want. If I want to walk all over people, I will do it, because there won't be any punishment for me waiting after I die.
This is a quite interesting for me, because what you say there resonates with me in a different way than it would to most people, I would say. I was asked it was about the end of 2021, beginning of 2022. I was asked to look into a nightclub being taken over by the Cray twins in London, and that led me to write eventually the Black Hand series, which looked at how, because what I discovered was astounding. It was unbelievable to me that what you're saying about Satanism there, the elite, the ruling class. Imagine trying to say to someone that and then them turn around and say, oh, well, prove it. Well, I went back in time and it was easy to prove. The nightclubs in after the World War were all being run by women who had to take over during World War, who'd had to step up to the plate. And a lot of them owned the nightclubs in the richest areas of London, where all of the elites went, where all the royals went. And they died one by one. And that's what interested me in the story at first. It was, in a sense, and I say this, I mean, I can barely mention her name without wanting to well up in tears, but a woman called Esmeralda Gulan, who is the first person who I wrote about in the Black Hand series, and she was found dead. Within a year and a half, there were about 6 or 7 nightclub girls who were running or owning nightclubs in the poshest areas of London, who died in really mysterious circumstances. One, it was said that the seconal she took wasn't enough to kill her, and the lamp cord she accidentally got wrapped around her own throat wasn't enough to choke her. But the combination of the two was what eventually killed her. When you actually investigate who took over, then it was a man called Horace Dibbin, who's what would go on to marry Ellen Novotny, and they would run the Man in the Mask Satanist sex parties, and he would write in the Mirror newspaper in 61, 62, just before the just during actually the downfall of the British government, and because of the Profumo affair, it led to him writing about how he had sold his soul over to Satan during the war, and that he had been followed by the Satanic Brotherhood ever since. Now, you couldn't believe most of what he was doing, because behind the scenes what he was doing is running the satanic sex parties, and all of the people who were going there were people like Prince Philip, Lord Mountbatten, and lots of other of the ruling establishment and the elite. I mean, John Profumo was someone who was in with these groups. It was a downfall of the British government was due to the Profumo affair, and he was going to these satanic sex parties too, and no one can really realize that is, that's how they saw a power. They seek power, and power is also in the divine, of course. And also, if you can't connect with the divine, then you may turn to what is below. And that is what they do. I find it extraordinary that when people make such claims as you made there, that that's my part of my job, is to go back in history and discover, oh yeah, they're completely true. And not only is it completely true, it's documentable. You can document the evidence. You can show people what actually happened. So, I mean, there's such talking about Satanism is a fantastic way to start, because really we are entering into a time now where people have lost moral compasses, and it allows war to happen more frequently and without any pushback, because it seems that going over, bombing people and killing children, that's fine. Do what thou willst. And it feels like we're living within that paradigm. Do what thou willst is all you got to think. Now, is it different on the other side, Marcus? Because the Russians, what I see in Russia and in the East is they still have an attachment to God, to church. Is that the main difference that divides us? And will that be the thing that turns the tide? And I mean this in the sense that if I go to Poland, I'm not going to see the same levels of immigration as I do over here. I'm going to see people going to church regularly. I'm going to see lots of the agenda not being able to be implemented in somewhere like Poland or even Ukraine, etc., and the like. These are countries. It's the Slovakian prime minister said, you know, we don't want what you have got over here, and then someone shot him. I mean, he survived it, but is it that these people are now looking at the West and what they're seeing is Satanism in action?
Well, even during the Soviet period, the Russian people never lost their faith in God. Indeed, their icons, if you went into a Russian household during the Soviet period, there would be a photograph of Lenin on the mantelpiece, and behind that there would be icons. So the Russian people never lost their Christian beliefs. To be Russian is to be Orthodox. On top of that, the Russian people are fiercely patriotic. They fiercely protect their culture. But during the 1990s, which constitutes one of the worst periods for the Russian people in history, because following the dissolution of the Soviet Union didn't collapse, the Soviet Union was dissolved. But following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the fabric of life in Russia was torn apart politically, economically, and culturally. And that is when the Western ruling elites, made great penetration in Russian society, the effects of which, I regret to say, are still being felt in Russia to this day, principally in Moscow and St. Petersburg. All in all, things are very sound in Russia, but you still have a degree of cultural decadence in Russia, which stems from the 1990s. But no race in the world is immune from the malignant ways of the Western ruling elites. So if Putin had not come to power in Russia, he became prime minister of Russia in August of 1999, and he became acting president of Russia on New Year's Eve in 1999. And then a few months later, into 2000, he became president. But if he had not become president, then it is possible that the cultural and spiritual values of the Russian people could have been extremely diluted. Again, no race in the world is immune from this horrific objective of the Western ruling elites. The Western ruling elites destroy races from within. And that clearly is the most effective way of destroying a race, through insidious measures, not sending your army to destroy a race. No, destroy their national identity, destroy their cultural and spiritual values, expose them to decadence, to sexual deviance, to depravity, distract them with rubbish such as celebrity culture and reality television, be done with documentaries. So what I'm trying to say, Johnny, is this: for the time being, the people of Poland, the people of Slovakia, the people of Hungary are fiercely protecting their national identity. But what happens if Fico in Slovakia is assassinated, or if he's overthrown, or if the same happens to Orban, and if they're replaced by a Western puppet, the borders will be open. Both countries would be flooded with immigrants. The culture would slowly start to be destroyed. You mentioned Poland. Well, politically, I have many, many problems with Poland, as you can no doubt guess. But in terms of the pride that the Polish people have in their national identity, I commend them, I salute them. But let us not forget that Tusk is back in power in Poland. And things have started to change there now in regard to immigration and in regard to so-called hate crime legislation. I say so-called because it's not hate. It's about suppressing freedom of speech, because the Western ruling elites know that one day people will realize they're being attacked. And when that day comes, they're going to have to be silenced through intimidation. Enter so-called hate crime legislation. So the Russian people, the Belarusian people, they're the same people, East Slavs, they are absolutely fine because they are protected. Their society is protected. Same applies to Hungary and Slovakia. But unless this evil, the evil of the Western ruling elites, and I use the word evil in a biblical sense, I don't mean evil in the sense of Hollywood. I truly mean evil in a biblical sense. Unless this evil is halted and then destroyed, I can't see what will stop the Western ruling elites from achieving their filthy, evil ways in countries such as Slovakia and Hungary. One of my areas of specialism is the former Yugoslavia, and in particular Serbia. Ever since the 5th of October of the year 2000, when President Slobodan Milosevic, again, he was demonized, dehumanized. Why? Because he stood up to the Western ruling elites. He was overthrown on that day. Ever since that day, 5th of October 2000, Serbia has been a colony of the West. The whole of the former Yugoslavia, Western Balkans, is a colony of the West. And whilst the Serb people are still maintaining their national identity, the Western ruling elites have made serious inroads into Serbian society. So I'll give you just one example, Johnny. A few years ago, there was a reality television program in Serbia, perhaps something similar to that ghastly Big Brother show that was shown in Britain and other countries in the Western world. And the Serbs were shocked because it showed in one episode an elderly man in his 70s, maybe in his 80s, having sex with a woman, I think in her 20s. Now, what is that all about? That's not entertainment. If an 80-year-old man and if a 20-year-old woman want to do that in the privacy of their own home, so be it. I'm not going to judge anyone, providing it involves adults and consenting adults. Then, you know, it's down to them. Though it must never be done in public. But this particular episode was part and parcel of the ongoing systematic attack on the Serbian national identity. And as I said, progress has been made. So the British people were once, as I said earlier, were once very pious. They were once patriotic, not as patriotic as the Germans or the French or the Russians or the Poles or the Serbs. No way. There's no empirically based evidence to suggest that. But still, if the British people, who were once church-going people, if they can be turned into people who now ridicule Christianity, then it shows that any race can be changed, because the methods that the Western ruling elites use have been tried and tested. They are so unbelievably dangerous. I go on a lot of television channels, Middle Eastern television news channels, and I say the same to seasoned Arab commentators and seasoned Iranian commentators. If the Western and ruling elites achieve their objective of destroying the nations of the Western world, then they will turn their attention next to West Asia, or Middle East, as most English-speaking people know it as, but it's actually West Asia. They will then increase the flow of celebrity culture and reality television programs in the Middle East, which they already have in countries such as Jordan and Iraq. But also, I've warned on television before, Middle Eastern news channels, I have warned they will flood the Middle East with immigrants from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from India, from sub-Saharan Africa, because the Western ruling elites know that the Arab people, the ordinary Arabs, are a thorn in their side, because the ordinary Arab is a pious person and is fiercely protective of their culture. So if the Western ruling elites win this war in the West, they will then turn their attention to the Middle East, and they will attempt to destroy Arab culture, Assyrian culture, all the other cultures of the peoples of the Middle East, by various methods, including flooding the region with immigrants.
Yeah, and when you're talking there's a lot of things that went through my mind. A lot of things. One of them, on the latter point, would be to think of Turkey, because I met lots of people who are from Turkey, and the west and the east of the country are very much different. The east, that pious nature, that the religious folk, they have a strong belief, and they have a strong culture, and they have a strong belief in God and doing right. And then that Istanbul sort of side, which has been so overexposed to the West, have this party spirit, this attitude that nothing really matters. And the country is nearly split down the middle in the way that it acts. And when, I mean, I think it's about 89, 90, 91, where I think the majority of what we saw, it was a shift in a paradigm. I mean, it wasn't just the end of the what they call the Cold War. I kind of say it's the beginning of a much more nefarious Cold War that you couldn't see anymore, that was able to be more subversive. But I mean, the Velvet Revolution was something that I studied in one article, and it was really interesting to see how the intelligence apparatus and the people who were working as spies in the East for the West were shocked that they were finally did it, that they finally caused the wall to fall, that they finally did it, and they didn't know what to do with this. And those color revolutions, as they happened, they were spurred on, of course, by NGOs, Western NGOs. The first color revolution was 50 to 150 NGOs in the country working full time, and that Czechoslovakia, before it split in two, was inundated with, it was already living in a grey world. The Soviet regime hadn't really colored their world in any way, so it was very easy for them to be dazzled by the lights of the West. And you start to see the fractures of societies as the West went in. And by the time they got to Ukraine in 2004, it's documented by the German Marshall Fund's own figures, that the West had, by that point, implanted over 30,000 non-governmental organizations within Ukraine to cause the Ukrainians to turn against what they saw traditionally as their cousins. The Russians were very much related to them before. I've spoken to loads of Ukrainians who say, oh no, it was like we were, and Russians who say it was like we were brother and sister before, like we were cousins, like we were related. And then that changed really abruptly. And I think back to one of the Sergei Skripal, Christopher Steele articles that I wrote, where Christopher Steele, of the famous Steele, the Trump Russia dossier, was actually at the Russian White House as Yeltsin was on top of a tank speaking, and he was watching this all happen, and it was almost like they had craved this for so long. They thought, that's it, we're going to change everything, and those color revolutions just spread like wildfire. And I feel that there's going to be a backlash to that eventually. Would the East be able? Are we going to see like a reverse color revolution happening at some point? Is there going to be a fight back? Because that's what I feel we've hit now. We've hit a point where the people of the East are saying the Western culture is dire. It looks awful. It looks like you're eating yourself. Why would I want to be part of that? I want to go back to the way things were before. So could we see like a reverse color revolution happening, or would the West not allow that?
Let me just clarify one point, Johnny, and I won't go too much into detail because otherwise it would just take us on a tangent. Mm-hmm. But what brought about the end of communism in Eastern Europe was not the actions of Western intelligence services or dissidents, no. It was on account of Mikhail Gorbachev, because his policies of glasnost and perestroika were catastrophic for the Soviet Union, and it paved the way for the end of communism in Eastern Europe and for the end of the Soviet Union. I'm not going to sit here and say that everything was wonderful under Soviet communism. As I have said for nearly 20 years now, on television, on radio, in speeches at universities and institutes, in opinion pieces, there were some remarkable achievements of Soviet communism, including in Eastern Europe. And there were some heinous aspects to Soviet communism. But Gorbachev, being the inept, useless leader that he was, brought about the end of Soviet communism. And I ponder from time to time about if Yuri Andropov, who took over from Brezhnev as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in November of 1982, if he had not succumbed to poor health towards the end of 1983 and then died in early of 1984, I think, Johnny, we would be living in a very different world today, because I think Andropov could have reformed the Soviet system without endangering the Soviet system himself. He was a fascinating person. For example, he was a teetotaler. He could not, literally, he could not understand why men commit adultery. He could not understand that. He was a fierce disciplinarian, and he stood a chance, a real chance of reforming the Soviet system, but it didn't happen. He died in early 1984. Konstantin Chernenko took over in early 1984, where he was hopeless. Though he was obviously not like Gorbachev. Gorbachev took over in early 1985. The rest is history. But the day that the Soviet communism ended in Eastern Europe, and in particular the day that the Soviet Union was dissolved, paved the way for the Western ruling elites to achieve global supremacy. And I don't think, Johnny, they would be able to do what they have done today in the Western world if Soviet communism was still about today. Now, you asked me a few moments ago about revolutions breaking out. Do you mean revolutions breaking out in the Western world?
I mean, I mean where East meets West. And yes, yeah, to an extent, I'd like to think that the far Western world would be able to fight back against what is currently happening. And you see it, but there needs to be exposure and education. And it's so well managed. People are so well manipulated. It's hard to see that happening. They like us to fight. They've learned how to turn us all on each other, and it works very well. I'm talking about those borderlines, those borderlands, the ones that are slowly succumbing, like the Polands, like the Slovakias, like the Hungaries, who are being pushed into this paradigm where it's, you know, it's like the color revolution can now be seen for what it is. The color revolutions of the past can now be seen what it is, and maybe there's likely to be some form of anti-color revolution, because when the Slovakia PM got in, he said quite clearly, we've swayed too far to the Western world, and the Western world looks like a mess. That is, I think, something that's echoed all over the East, and I feel that, you know, as our societies break apart, as we flood our streets with economic migrants, as we ruin our societies, the East is watching on and seeing this all happen. It's not like they can't see it happen, and it must look grotesque to a lot of those people who are still within a paradigm that's relatively closer to the past. So I'm wondering, could there be the anti-color revolutions, you could say, from the other way? Is that what we could see in the near future?
Well, for some 35 years now, the Western ruling elites have ruled the countries of Eastern Europe and those countries which were Soviet satellite states, such as Hungary, because of course Hungary is not in Eastern Europe. And there has been great deterioration in those countries, but still the people are holding out. And that is something that gives me great pleasure to see and gives me great hope. I believe, Johnny, that continental Europe, the whole of continental Europe, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Baltic Sea, to the Black Sea, to the Mediterranean Sea, to the Aegean Sea, to the Adriatic, I believe continental Europe will liberate itself. And I say that because whilst I'm very well aware that continental Europe is in a terrible, terrible state, I am a quarter German. I'm a quarter English, a quarter German, and half Greek, specifically half Greek Cypriot. And I am
well, at least you got half of it right.
Yes, absolutely. And
I'm a Welshman, I just say that.
And I'm absolutely disgusted. I'm sickened to the core of my stomach by what has happened to Germany. But the levels of patriotism in continental Europe were always so much higher, as I said moments ago, than the level of patriotism in Britain. So whilst the levels of patriotism in continental Europe have been brought down quite significantly because of the evil, insidious measures of the Western ruling elites, they're still higher today than what they are in Britain. So I do believe that continental Europe will liberate itself. So we see wonderful political parties and movements in continental Europe. There is a serious fight back there. there's no point. It's unfair for someone to say, in response to what I've just said, yes, but Marcus, the Western ruling elites are still in power. Well, yes, you know, Western Europe has been ruled by the British and the American establishments since 1945. And since the end of 1989, parts of Central Europe and Eastern Europe have also been ruled by the Western ruling elites. So they have caused carnage in continental Europe. It can't happen overnight. You know, for example, the British ruling elite, ever since Germany, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, and then a year later when Germany, the German states unified to form Germany, the British ruling elite waited for an opportunity to destroy Germany. Churchill was one such example of a member at the heart of the British ruling elite who sought to destroy Germany. And from 1945 onwards, the British ruling elite were presented with their opportunity, because the British ruling elite understood from the late 19th century onwards that the two major European forces which posed the greatest threat to the British Empire, the British ruling elite, is Germany and Russia. So again, continental Europe can liberate itself for the reasons I've stated. As regards Britain, people who have been following me for nearly 2 decades know that I have little to no faith in the British people, and I am open about that. I'm delighted that millions of British people have become enlightened because of the COVID lie and everything else it opened their eyes to. I'm delighted that they are now aware of the nefarious nature of the British ruling elite. But still, they do not resist. They don't resist like people, for example, in the southern states, the old Confederacy in America, do. They don't resist, excuse me, like people in Germany do, or in France do. There's just, it's just not there. And worst of all, Johnny, are the parents in Britain. 99% of British parents are absolutely appalled by what is being taught at British schools. And because of the puppet Starmer, this will get worse and worse and worse. For example, the introduction of the critical race theory, which of course is anti-white in nature. But even though these parents are aware of the danger, they still don't take it up. They don't confront the schools. They don't confront the headmasters, the headmistresses, or the teachers. And I find that absolutely appalling. For me, that is absolutely unforgivable. If you're going to be a parent, you have to be prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice in defending your children. They won't do it. Yeah. So it pains me to say, Johnny, that whilst I'm very confident that continental Europe will liberate itself, the British people will not liberate themselves. I think their liberation, as I said at the beginning of our discussion, will only come if the system in America collapses. Because if the system in America collapses, then the British ruling elite cannot do it alone. And maybe with the upcoming presidential election this November in America, maybe that's the opportunity, because if Trump wins, and if he sticks to his promise of attempting to destroy the American ruling elite, then the British people could be saved. If he backs off, then millions of his support base will take matters into their own hands. If the American ruling elite, if the federal government steal the election this November, like they did in November of 2020, then millions of ordinary Americans will rise. This July, I attended a wedding in Florida, in Collier County, which is on the western part of Florida, where the Gulf of Mexico is. And I spoke to many people there, men and women. And virtually every one of them, Johnny, said, we are ready for war. And I will tell you this from now, Johnny, and to your audience, they truly mean it. I don't know what people in the northern states are like. You know, clearly states like New York and California are just wastelands, are just horrific places. But I can tell you the people in the southern states are ready for war. So this is how the British people could be saved. If, of course, and it is possible, nothing comes from what I said. I don't want to see war in America, by the way, but that system has to come to an end. And I hope and I pray it can be done peacefully, because one of the reasons I hate the Western ruling elites is because of their love of violence, their love of war. But I'm simply relaying now to you and to your audience what people in Florida said, and they are ready for war there. And of course, they are armed to the teeth there. Mm-hmm. So I do believe that continental Europe will free itself of the shackles of the Western ruling elites. As for the British people, well, they need to take a good, long look at themselves, at their behaviour, and they need to understand that Britain is not the world, and the world is most certainly not Britain. They need to come to terms with how they have been extraordinarily ignorant and joyfully ignorant for decades and decades. And also, Johnny, they need to grow a backbone. That's what they need to grow. Again, I'm not interested in hearing, I'm only obeying instructions, I'm just safeguarding my salary. No, you're not safeguarding yourself or your family. You're digging a grave for yourself and your family. Learn to say no. Learn to protest. Protest peacefully. Learn to defy peacefully. If the British people overnight, Johnny, said no to this nefarious agenda, no is no is no, then what can the British ruling elite do? What can they do? In an ideal world for them, they would like to send the tanks out, but they can't do that because they still maintain the myth, and it's just a grotesque myth, that the British ruling elite are the defenders of human rights and freedom and democracy. So they can't do that. So again, the British people could put a stop to this. Mm-hmm. But the question is, will they?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. I tell you, there's when he was talking there, I was thinking that the issue might have happened centuries ago with the British people, because I tend to go really deep into history, and I do a lot of roaming around. I like to do family histories. I like to go back to like the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s. I've done a lot of research in that period. I was brought up in a 17th century enactment society called the Sealed Knot, and my dad was a commanding officer of a regiment, so I was always interested in with cannons going off around me, muskets and swords anyway. But I think Henry VIII did a number on us in many ways, especially like things like the annexation of Wales, because people in Wales forgot who they were. They didn't realize they were 4 different tribes. And I find it very interesting that when you look at a genetic map of the UK, you discover that the tribes haven't gone anywhere. You know, the people of the Elmet still live in Leeds. The people of the the Humbers still live up north. The North Humbers, the South Humbers, the Lancs still live up there as well. They're genetically different. The southeast, of course, is a lot of the southeast of England is obviously dominated by French ancestry, and the Cornish and the Devonian are still in the place they've been for many years, thousands of years, with a line, a border that runs not only on the map but runs also genetically. The Scottish have loads of different. I think if people were able to get in touch with who they really are rather than looking at a map, and I do think that a lot of that the creation of, oh, we're all one, we're all united. Well, we're not. We're continuously divided, and we're not one. We're a load of different people, and we should embrace that. And we should embrace we should have kept hold of each of our traditions and our identities, and not keep merging them into each other so that we can feel like we're all one when we're not. And I do feel that the problem is with Britain is no one really knows who they are. They think they know who they are, but they've been taught that that's not who they really are. Down to blood, down to if you test your own genetics, you'll discover who you are. And it's a very interesting way to look at things as well, just to be able to understand how things could be different. I would love to see Britain be divided up into genetic maps and see what we make of that at the end of it, to be honest, because I think we would be able to look at our own tribal ancestry and our own history and be a lot more humane and human and moral and ethical, because we realize that we have a natural urge to protect our own, and this has been proven many times. I do want to go across, there's a couple of questions I want to ask, because something we were talking about probably about 20 minutes ago I want to talk about, and then I want to move down slowly towards Turkey, Cyprus, and then the Middle East on the way up. But one of the things is that when you said there, it wasn't necessarily Western intelligence meddling. A lot of it was to do with Gorbachev. Do you think that there's a chance that Gorbachev was very likely linked with intelligence? Western intelligence?
No, that is an impossibility. There is no way that Gorbachev could have risen up the ladder of power in the Communist Party if he was an agent of the West. It's just impossible. The KGB, which of course was the sword and shield of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, knew every aspect of the lives of people who were on the Politburo and who were on the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev was fortunate in that a lot of this comes down to Brezhnev. There was a lot of stability achieved under Brezhnev. And of course, it was under Brezhnev when the Soviet Union achieved nuclear parity with America and actually frog-leaped America. The Soviet Union developed in the 70s the largest, most powerful nuclear arsenal in the world. And of course, the Russian Federation inherited that. And today in 2024, the nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation is still the largest and the most powerful. But one of the downsides to the period of Brezhnev is that new, fresh, young blood was not coming in to the leadership of the Communist Party. It was not coming into the Politburo. It was not coming into the Central Committee. So if you have a look, it's one old man after another. Brezhnev dies, you have an old man in the form of Andropov. Andropov dies, you have an old man in the form of Chernenko. Then that leaves Gorbachev, who became General Secretary of the Communist Party in '85. He was in his 50s. So he was very fortunate. And at that time, the Soviet economy was in trouble. there was a bleeding wound in the form of Afghanistan. And what the Soviet Union needed was a very strong leader who would reform the Soviet economy and then, and only then, look to reform other aspects of Soviet society. Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika at the same time, which was a recipe for disaster. Also, Johnny, and I won't dwell on this any longer, but Gorbachev's command of the Russian language was woeful. And that's because his education, his schooling was interrupted. Gorbachev was from Stavropol. And in 1942, the Wehrmacht arrived in Stavropol. They occupied it as part of their drive on the oil fields of the Caucasus and their drive on Stalingrad, the great city on the Volga. So Gorbachev's education was disrupted and he never recovered from it. So his command of the Russian language was poor. Now, why do I say that's important? Because of this. So he spoke about perestroika, reconstruction. We know it as economic reconstruction. Well, it's illogical. He said the Soviet economic system is not working, so let's introduce perestroika. If something isn't working, Johnny, why would you reconstruct it? You construct something new. So from the very start of perestroika, it was wrong because the word he chose was wrong. But that's for another day's discussion.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, though. It's a question I felt I had to ask because I do a lot of research into intelligence meddling, of course, infiltration into foreign governments by Western intelligence, including a lot of the Russian American sort of war. Well, you say American. I say American. In the 70s, the Germans were actually paying the German Marshall Fund and others to do for the Americans and the deep state to do their work for them. So it's never as simple as it's just the Americans or the West fighting. It was very much, there was still a central Germanic theme in there. They were still pushing. They were still the ones who were trying to push for change in a way that would suit the West. But I never got round to actually investigating Gorbachev or any of his actions because I just never felt it was necessary. And I didn't ever get any sort of sign of that. So I was just interested in asking that question. But a kind of similar question, because I talk about the German Marshall Fund there, and one of the leadership courses the German Marshall Fund run, and many people, including Ovcott, who's dead now, who's a German journalist, said that the German Marshall Fund was a CIA front, and it was set up by David Rockefeller and a lot of the guys who McCloy and others who were all CIA linked. So it does seem like that. And they ran a load of leadership courses that were targeting 4 or 5 nations in particular, Ukraine and others around the borders of Russia. And one of the people who went through that course, one of those courses, which was called the Marshall Memorial Leadership Fund, I believe, was Viktor Orban, who also went through the first year of the Global Leaders for Tomorrow World Economic Forum, when they all flooded east really quickly. I mean, the 1993 one was World Economic Forum was, I think it was 1993 one, was held in Ukraine itself. You've got the pictures of them all boarding the plane, Schwab and others going to do a special World Economic Forum summit in Ukraine, kind of celebrating, oh look, the West, we've won. That itself, I've documented the World Economic Forum as a CIA led sort of course that came from Kissinger's International Seminar, and was heavily funded by the deep state. Again, Rockefeller money in there too, roaming around. And Viktor Orban, if I look at that information, I would say instantly, oh, obviously he works for the CIA. But then his actions seem to be opposing. Now, it leads me to think he's either one of two things. Either he sees the issues that are in the West from his experience within the West, or he is bought and paid for by the West and created into being an antithesis of their thesis, and so is able to then push forward some sort of agenda behind the scenes and support it or support being the enemy of the West. That's a little bit of more of a stretch, I think. Who do you think Viktor Orban is, from your research or from what you've understood?
Well, there is a third possible explanation, Johnny, in regard to Orban. Perhaps he believed in the, quote, Western dream at one point in his life. Perhaps he did believe in it. And then when he became involved in it, he, at some point, concluded that it's anything but a dream. It's a nightmare. It's hell on earth. And he broke away from it. I think that when it comes to any politician in the Western world, and I mean the whole of Europe, because we can't say that countries such as Romania and Bulgaria in the Western world, because when we talk about the Western world, we're talking about the nucleus, which is the English-speaking countries of the Western world: Britain, America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But if we just say the Western world and their control of the whole of continental Europe, any politician, even if they profess anti-elite opinions, we should not trust them per se. We should judge them by their actions. So far, Orban has not disappointed. So far. Is there corruption in Hungary under him? Well, of course there is. Wherever you find human beings in the world, you will find corruption. But in terms of protecting Hungary's borders, in terms of protecting the cultural and spiritual values of the Hungarian people, he's to be applauded. In terms of ensuring that Hungary is not dragged into a possible war with Russia, there won't be a war with Russia, but hypothetically speaking, he is to be applauded. He is putting Hungary first. The same applies to Fico in Slovakia. We have to keep on monitoring people like Orban and Fico. If there's any change, then that has to be accounted for. Someone like Meloni in Italy, well, I don't know, Johnny, why people fell for her in the first place, because long had she been involved with various nefarious institutes and clubs in the Western world run by the Western ruling elites. So she was clearly never one of us in the first place. And the fact that she's not allowing Italy to be flooded, there's a lot of immigrants coming into Italy now, but it's not being flooded like Britain is. That reason is, well, one of the reasons is this: the Italian people, by and large, are still very patriotic, are very pious. So Meloni, the puppet, has to be careful, and her masters have to be careful. No different to Greece. The Greek people are, fervently religious and fervently patriotic. The collaborators in Athens have no love for Greek culture. They have no love for Greek history, no love for Greek heritage. Their loyalty is to money, materialism, and other, putting it in colloquial English, other perks of the job. many of which are horrific. But the reason why the Greek government is not flooding Greece with immigrants is because that could provoke a very serious backlash from the Greek people. So whilst insidious measures are being played out by the Western ruling elites in Greece aimed at one day destroying the Greek national identity, they can't do in Greece what they have done, for example, in Britain, because the levels of Greek patriotism dwarf levels of patriotism in Britain, and they, for centuries, have. And there are reasons for that, which one day in another discussion we can discuss. But anyhow, Orban is so far demonstrating that he's protecting his people, and so far Fico in Slovakia is doing exactly the same. We have to be vigilant 24/7 with people who are fighting the Western ruling elites, because there's nothing to say that one day they won't be bought.
Yeah, and there's a lot of money flowing around to buy such people as well.
Yes.
We've got an interesting situation going on in the world at the moment. We got clearly like Israel are escalating conflicts in the Middle East. Clearly, there's a divide that is clear. Those that are influenced by the West seem to be all along one border now, and those who are influenced by the East are on the opposing border. So we're seeing this sort of systematic shape of the world of who's on what side happen. And you get down to Turkey, and you see that Turkey have, they, like I was saying earlier, they kind of keep one foot in the west on the Istanbul side and one foot on the east on the other side. And what do you think to Turkey? What do you think to Erdogan? Where do you think if war was to break out, which between Russia and the West as a whole, which side would Turkey sit on?
Well, first of all, Turkey is an ardent friend and ally of the West, specifically America and Britain. Turkey is not a colony of the West's. Cyprus, for example, is a colony of the West's. Turkey isn't. Whilst the Turkish people, and I agree with what you said earlier, the far western part of Turkey, that's where there's a lot of Western influence. For example, people say Istanbul, I prefer Constantinople. But still the Turkish people...
We can sing songs about that till the cows come
home. The Turkish people are, fiercely patriotic. They're more patriotic than what they are religious. They are religious, but their levels of patriotism exceed their levels of piety. But it is in Turkey's interests to be in the Western political, economic, and military orbit. Why? Because Turkey's leaders, be it nationalist or Islamist as they are now, or a combination of both, because Erdogan is a mixture of Islamism and nationalism, it means that Turkey will continue to receive, as it has since, let's say, 1948, a blank check of support from both America and Britain to do whatever it pleases in the region. So Turkey would never have invaded Cyprus in 1974 and murdered, raped, and displaced hundreds of thousands of Greek Cypriots had it not have been for the support it receives from Washington and London. Turkey would never have invaded northern Syria and continue to be in northern Syria as Turkey continues to illegally occupy the north of Cyprus if it wasn't for the support it receives from America and Britain. Turkey would not be able to invade northern Iraq on a regular basis if it wasn't for the support it receives from Washington and London. There is an unbreakable strategic partnership between Britain and Turkey, and America and Turkey. So Erdogan, in public, professes to be independent, but he's playing to his audience. In what he says in public is very different to what he says in private to the British and the Americans. Erdogan is an astute leader. He's a shrewd man. He knows it would be suicidal for Turkey to withdraw from the West's sphere of influence. Because if that happened, and it won't, but hypothetically speaking, if it happened, then the Americans would turn on Turkey and say, pull out your army of occupation from Cyprus, pull out your army of occupation from Syria, and so on and so on. And the Americans could start supporting the PKK, a Kurdish resistance movement in Turkey. So Erdogan is not going to allow Turkey to commit suicide. Hypothetically speaking, you asked if there was a war between the West and Russia, which means America and Russia. I do not believe that Erdogan would allow Turkey to be pulled into that. And I believe there are other countries in NATO who would also not go ahead and take part in that war. I believe NATO is far from being a solid military bloc. And I believe that at the heart of NATO, there is serious doubt as to whether each and every member of the military bloc would go ahead with Article 5 if it was invoked. And I believe Turkey is one such country which would not do that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I've always seen it as the linchpin in plans. I do think that the Turkish still have the ability to become an empire again one day, and I'm sure that some of their leaders have a little bit of lust for that. They want to go back that way, but the dynamics, the international dynamics doesn't suit. So one more hypothetical before we move on to talking about say Cyprus more. One hypothetical. What if what you talked about earlier, and there is a fracture, there is a civil war in America, there is some form of conflict that keeps the Americans busy. What would happen to places in places like Turkey and in the East if the Europeans no longer have that sort of support from America and can no longer rely on its American allies? What would we see these allegiances change then?
If America descends into civil war, then that will be the end of NATO. NATO is America. America is NATO. As Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General of NATO, said famously of NATO, NATO exists to keep the Americans in Europe, the Germans down in Europe, and the Russians out of Europe. In regard to the latter, it's somewhat illogical because Russia is part of Europe. Europe ends at the Ural Mountains. But anyway, that's what Lord Ismay said. But if America was to collapse, descend into civil war, that would mark the end of NATO. However much the British ruling elite might huff and puff, they are nothing without the Americans. What would that mean for the nations of Europe, such as Turkey? Well, it would mean that, first of all, they would truly be free. They would truly be sovereign nations, sovereign countries. And they would start looking to sign treaties with countries whomever they want. at the same time, they would be conscious that they have to abide by certain rules. Wars will always continue to happen in the world. As long as there's human beings about, there will always be wars. But even a country like Turkey understands that it has to be careful. And without America, as I said, Turkey would not have the level of military strength that it does. So Turkey could not start wars like it historically has. For example, when it illegally invaded Cyprus, when it illegally invaded Syria. So of course, there would be some uncertainty in a new Europe. Of course there would be. But at the same time, it would be an opportunity for countries to realize that here is an opportunity to ensure that they don't ever again come under the heel of foreign occupiers. And I agree with you, Johnny, that the Turks do have imperialism in their DNA. I think an Egyptian would say that, a Greek would say that, a Bulgarian would say that, an Armenian would say that, an Iraqi would say that, a Syrian would say that. These are countries who have suffered terribly because of the Turks, horrifically, in fact. But Turkey, despite that, would know that they don't have that military muscle and they don't have that political cover that they once enjoyed because of America. So the answer to your question is that even a country like Turkey would be compelled to be very, very careful with how it treads in a new world where the Western ruling elites have either fallen from power or they no longer have the power, anywhere near the power they once enjoyed.
Yeah. I saw I made a mini documentary sort of series. There's kind of like questions whether something is a conspiracy theory, and they called it like is Palestine a conspiracy theory? Because lots of people say that Palestine don't exist. So I went back in history, and at the start of that, you've got like the map of the Ottoman Empire over say 500 years, and how it expanded and retracted over that time. And it's definitely their empires come to an end, and they have found their borders now. I'd like to think that there would be more stability if what you say, if NATO was to fall apart because the Americans are too busy concentrating on their own business, whether that be civil war, just whether that be them taking a different approach to global politics. But I do always feel that from my years of playing Risk and Axis and Allies and other war games, I always know that the winner is always the one that takes Turkey. And that seems to be something that's a theme throughout history. And at the moment, the West are winning. And as you say, Turkey is aligned with the West, but that hasn't been so historically. But it could easily, I mean, we know. I agree with you. I agree with you very much. I think it's trying to rationalize the idea of how these independent nation states would act without the influence of America is mind bending. It's really hard because we automatically want to look back in history. Yeah, history is only going to tell us what happened in the past. It's not going to tell us what's happening in the future. Certainly we can certainly see cycles repeating when we look at history all of the time, but we don't necessarily see it exactly the same, and dynamics change. Now we're talking about that region, and I know you're very interested to talk about Cyprus, and it is a very interesting region. Somewhere where, I mean, as growing up, we heard a lot going on there. You know, there was a lot about the influence within Cyprus, the wars, etc. Can you give us a little bit of a rundown for people who don't understand who owns Cyprus at the moment, you could say, and why Cyprus is so important, especially to the British?
Up until the end of the 19th century, Cyprus was ruled by the Turks. Cyprus was part of the Ottoman Empire. Then, at the end of the 19th century, Britain took over Cyprus. Britain began to administer, that was the word, began to administer Cyprus. Then, after World War I, following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Britain, the British Empire, annexed Cyprus. So Cyprus became a colony of Britain's. Then from the mid-1950s to the 1960s, there was a war of liberation being waged by the Greek Cypriots in Cyprus. AOCA were fighting against the British. And the British, because their military power was declining, indeed, World War II marked the end of British global military power. Let us not forget, let us put the propaganda to the side. In military terms, World War II was a disaster for Britain, and Churchill personified that disaster. Look at all the campaigns which he presided over, which were absolute military disasters. Norway, France, Greece, Crete. So by the mid-1950s, British power is seriously on the decline. And also at that time, in the mid-1950s, you had the Suez Canal crisis. So the British in Cyprus understood that they just didn't have the resources to keep on fighting AOCA. So in 1960, the British gave Cyprus what was in reality nominal independence. By that point, the British had played a card which they are masters of, experts of: divide and rule. They began to play off the Turkish Cypriot minority against the Greek Cypriot majority, which ensured that Cyprus could not become part of Greece, which was known as Enesis. Before then, Turkey wasn't interested in Cyprus, but because the British began alleging that the Turkish Cypriot minority were threatened by the Greek Cypriots, which they weren't, and because the British orchestrated atrocities against the Turkish Cypriots and then blamed it on the Greek Cypriots, Turkey was compelled to show interest in Cyprus. So in 1960, Britain gives Cyprus nominal independence. And I say nominal because Cyprus to this day remains a colony of Britain's and also of America's. Why was it nominal independence? Because Britain maintained its political, economic, and military foothold on the island. So there are British overseas territories in Cyprus, which comprise major British military bases. It's often said, Johnny, on television, for example, on the BBC News or Sky News or the Telegraph newspaper, that Britain has military bases in Cyprus. That is not accurate. Britain has overseas territories in Cyprus which comprise British military bases, meaning there is British sovereign territory in Cyprus. Not British military bases, British sovereign territory in Cyprus. Britain, in order from 1960 onwards, in order to ensure that it did not lose its foothold in Cyprus, they began to look into partition. Because if Cyprus is divided between Turkey, an outside force, and the Greek Cypriots, then that would mean that Britain would forever be in Cyprus, because Britain has a strategic partnership with Turkey. So you fast forward to 1974, there is the then president of Cyprus, Makarios, is overthrown by the pro-American, pro-British military junta in Athens, which means that because Turkey is one of the three guarantor powers of Cyprus, the other two being Britain and Greece, which means that Turkey has a right to invade Cyprus and restore the status quo, which was called Attila I, which is what they did in July of 1974. But within a day or 2 days, the military junta has collapsed in Greece, and Makarios is back in power in Cyprus, which means the Turkish army should be withdrawn because the status quo has been restored in Cyprus. But just a few weeks later, after the first phase of the Turkish invasion, Attila I, the Turks launch Attila II, which involves conquering even more territory in Cyprus and bringing thousands more Turks there. So that is why the Turkish invasion was illegal. The Turks, for 50 years now, continue to illegally occupy the north of Cyprus. A spotlight should be placed on the British, because, as I said, Britain is one of the guarantor powers, which means that if the territorial integrity of the Republic of Cyprus is threatened, then Britain must take military action. Britain didn't in 1974. Far from it. The British gave military assistance to the Turks. They gave intelligence to the Turks, and they gave logistical help to the Turks. Ever since the Turkish invasion, what has happened? Well, thousands of Greek Cypriots were murdered. Thousands of Greek Cypriot women were raped. Thousands have disappeared. Well over 200,000 Greek Cypriots were ethnically cleansed. All signs of Greek Cypriot heritage in the north of Cyprus, for example, churches and monasteries, have been virtually destroyed or turned into mosques. Hundreds of thousands of Turks from Turkey and some Kurds have been brought to the illegally occupied part of Cyprus to change the demographics, to ensure that there will never again be a Greek presence there. Now, the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which the Turks created and which only Turkey recognizes, is completely illegal, a complete illegal entity under international law. So only Turkey recognizes that. However, the British ruling elite, being the most devious, the most deceitful, and the most duplicitous in the world and in history, listen to this, Johnny. They have given what is a de facto embassy to the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in London. Very few people are aware of that. Indeed, I first became aware of it in the early 2000s when I just happened to walk past it one day. Now, very few people in the Greek Cypriot community, which is mostly in North London, very few of them were aware of this, and I made them aware of it. So the British ruling elite, the Foreign Office, to be precise, need to explain why have they given what is a de facto embassy to an illegal entity which Britain doesn't recognise, because Britain doesn't recognise the independence of Abkhazia or South Ossetia, which broke away from Georgia in 2008. Well, they proclaimed independence in 2008. They broke away from Georgia in the early 1990s, but Britain doesn't recognize them. Fine. Therefore, Britain doesn't allow them to have a diplomatic presence in Britain. Fine. But why does Britain allow the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus to have a diplomatic presence in Britain? It is because Britain and Turkey enjoy a strategic partnership with each other. And the British care nothing for what the Turks have done in the north of Cyprus. They don't care about Greek Cypriot women having been raped and Greek Cypriot men having been raped. Thousands murdered, thousands taken to Turkey, never seen before. Well over 200,000 ethnic cleansed. They don't care about that. It's because Turkey is extremely important to British power in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Middle East. So Britain is one of the masters of Cyprus, one of the colonial masters of Cyprus. The Americans are also firmly there. There are many CIA stations in the illegally occupied part of Cyprus. The French now have a military presence in Cyprus. The Israelis, another duplicitous ruling elite, they have a political and economic presence, not just in the free part of the Republic of Cyprus, but also in the illegally occupied part of Cyprus. People are not aware that ever since the early 1980s, Johnny, Turkey and Israel have enjoyed a strategic partnership with each other, which centers very heavily on military collaboration. It matters not that there is an issue between Netanyahu and Erdogan. It doesn't matter. What matters is that strategic partnership is in check. The Turkish and Israeli militaries conduct maneuvers. They conducted a maneuver with each other only last year, a major maneuver. Also, the Israelis assist the Turks in helping to limit public exposure across the world of the Armenian genocide. Because the Turks obviously committed the Armenian genocide. The Israelis deny the Armenian genocide. The Israelis use their global influence and power to limit awareness of the Armenian genocide. So they have scuppered numerous conferences aimed at informing people about the Armenian genocide. The British, by the way, the British ruling elite also deny the Armenian genocide. British mainstream media has long labelled me as a genocide denier. Why? Because I say that what happened at Srebrenica in the summer of 1995 was not genocide, it was a war crime. But I'm labelled as a genocide denier. Well, how would you describe the British ruling elite? They're the biggest genocide deniers in the world. They deny the Armenian genocide. They deny the Irish genocide. They deny the Native American genocide. They deny the Aboriginal genocide and the Indian genocide. In large measure because, apart from the Armenian genocide, which they deny, they committed all of the other genocides. So it's quite telling, isn't it, that the media, British mainstream media, describes me as a genocide denier. But of course, they won't refer to the British state as a genocide denier when Britain denies many genocides, such as the Armenian genocide. But anyhow, returning to Cyprus, Cyprus is known, unfortunately, as the whore of the Mediterranean, as the whore of West Asia, because of all the different masters there. And what enrages me, Johnny, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, what enrages me about the Greek Cypriot diaspora in Britain is this. The self-appointed leaders of the Greek Cypriot diaspora in Britain, principally in North London where they live, they do not confront the British state. So, for example, they don't create public awareness as to why Britain did not come to the military assistance of the Republic of Cyprus in 1974, when it was legally obliged to. They don't confront the British state as to why the British state has given a de facto embassy to the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in London. They don't confront the British state about Britain's strategic partnership with Turkey. They don't confront the British state concerning the British state's military and economic support and aid which it gives to Turkey year on year, and the British state's blank check of support which it gives to Turkey year on year. They don't do that. Instead, what do? They're obsequious. They vie with each other for photographs with British MPs and British ministers. Well, how's that helping the Republic of Cyprus? How's that helping the murdered, the raped, the missing, the ethnically cleansed, the destruction of Greek Cypriot heritage in the illegally occupied parts? Now, I believe I know the answer as to why the self-appointed leaders of the Greek Cypriot community don't ask those questions. It's down to you, your audience, and others to come to their own conclusions. But when I speak about the Republic of Cyprus, I speak for the murdered, the raped, the missing, the ethnically cleansed, and the cultural destruction of the Greek Cypriot presence in the north of Cyprus. I have no regard for British MPs or British ministers whatsoever, because I know the true face of the British ruling elite. And as for those MPs in North London, well, yes, they turn up at Greek Cypriot events. Why? Because they're after the vote of Greek Cypriots. And the next day they'll be at a Turkish Cypriot event. And the next day they will be at a Somalian event or a Pakistani event, because of course there's a lot of ethnic minorities in North London. They don't care about Cyprus. They're there for the votes. And I'll tell you this as well, Johnny, because I've chaired some of the meetings before in North London where British MPs have been. They have virtually no knowledge of Cyprus. They turn up there, and this is what they say: we love Greek Cypriot food. We love Greek Cypriot drink. We love Greek Cypriot climate. We love the hospitality of Greek Cypriots. And we just want peace in Cyprus. How disrespectful is that to the victims of the Turkish invasion, that brutal, sadistic invasion? How disrespectful is that to them? And yet, they continue to be invited to Greek Cypriot meetings. Why? Why would you invite them there? So I am very despondent about what is happening in Cyprus, which has been what has been happening to Cyprus for many, many decades now. Cyprus is a Western colony. The Israelis are increasing their presence there in the free part and in the illegally occupied part. And of course, when the Americans and the British bombed, or let's just say when the British bombed Syria, and when the British were bombing the Houthis, they used the military bases on the British overseas territories in Cyprus to do so. And also the savage Israeli war against the Palestinian people in Gaza is being aided by the British military presence in the British overseas territories in Cyprus. So the British, like the Americans, like the French, like the Israelis, and like the Turks, they just use and abuse Cyprus. They have no regard for Greek Cypriot heritage, for Greek Cypriot history, for the beautiful landscape, the beautiful climate of Cyprus. They couldn't care less about that. They're there in Cyprus to firstly maintain their influence and power in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Middle East, and also to strengthen their influence and power in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Middle East. It is a very depressing state of affairs. And again, when will someone from the Greek Cypriot diaspora in Britain or in America or in Canada and Australia truly fight on behalf of the murdered, the raped, the missing, the ethnically cleansed, and the cultural destruction in the illegally occupied part of Cyprus? When will that ever happen?
I have to say that's a powerful way to end this as well, with that one question, because I mean, a lot of my research when I'm tracking people down who work for intelligence, etc., is so many times where you come across the moment when they were stationed in Cyprus. It seems like a rite of passage for a lot of intelligence agents. It's an alarm for me. It's an alarm bell. And yeah, agreed. It's Syria conflict, others, especially with bombing raids. It's been a hub, and it's a very useful strategic hub. I think the moment when that will change is when the technology means that they don't need to, like planes, etc., and operations don't need to be run from so close to their intended targets. And then, you know what they do? They always leave these people to the wolves, really. That's the way the British always have. That's the way the West always are. And it'll continue to be that way. Marcus, I tell you, it's been a pleasure to listen to you. It's been a pleasure to discuss these things with you. I feel like I've learned like valuable points, which I'm going to go away and I'm going to be thinking about this. I mean, I when I'm editing, etc., I do watch these interviews again, and there's a few points where I believed in a certain paradigm, or I believe I knew how the paradigm was, and you've shifted my opinion of it, and with good reason and with good points. You're a very interesting fella. Where can people find your work nowadays, and what's your plans for the future?
Well, I will never surrender. I will never submit. I will never compromise. My opinions will follow me to my grave. I have incurred enormous cost over the last 20 or so years, because I will never surrender and I will never be bought. I can be found on Facebook and on X and on Gab and on Getter. I have written 2 books, both published. They can be purchased on Amazon. Yes, I know I don't like Amazon, but I have to try and use all outlets out there to attempt to try and get my work known to as many people as possible. But both of my books, the first one, Arise, Rossiya, The Return of Russia to World Politics, is on Amazon. The second one, which came out in November of 2023, Whitehall in Stalin's Russia, British Assessments of the Red Army, 1934 to 1945, can also be bought on Amazon. Both books earned the very positive endorsements from very senior military officers and very senior academics. For example, my new book, Whitehall in Stalin's Russia, gained the endorsements of retired senior American Army and Air Force colonels. Alternatively, people can buy the books for myself. All of my, or most of my my interviews on news channels, podcast channels, my speeches are on my YouTube channel, and also on odyssey. You ask about the future. Myself alone, endurance and endeavour. I will keep on fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting. As I said, I will never capitulate. I will never submit. I will never compromise. I will take my views to the grave. And I just want to say this, Johnny, that one of the privileges I gained from having given interviews to TNT is having got to know you. You are a very enlightened man. You are a very respectful man, a very courteous man, and a very open-minded man. You're clearly a very principled man, and I have no doubt that if we were to meet in person, we could talk all day and all night long. And I want to say that I'm grateful to you for having given me the opportunity to interview me on TNT and now to interview me for your podcast channel. And secondly, if at least a quarter of the British population, the British people, were like you, then we wouldn't be facing oblivion as what we face now. So I just want to thank you for your opportunities. Thank you for being open-minded with my opinions. And I sincerely hope that we will continue to work with each other. And I have thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. I think it's gone on for something like 2 hours. I have enjoyed each and every second and minute of it. So again, thank you ever so much, Johnny, for being the man that you are.
You're a beautiful man, Marcus. You're going to fill me with tears. I tell you what, I'll try within the next few weeks to make it down to London, and then we can have a drink and maybe catch a bite to eat together, and we can have a long conversation, and we can do that because I agree. I met loads of people around, and many of them pretend to have knowledge. Many of them pretend to have ethics, pretend to have morals. But you're you're a great person to meet. You're very courteous in return, and thank you, my friend. And that's it. Thank you for coming on the NEWSPASTE Podcast.
Thank you so much, Johnny.
Shaping a great reset for the post-corona era.